Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stefan Livera podcast, brought to you by Bold, the best place to buy your Bitcoin. So for American listeners, go to getbold.io. Now, joining me today for the first time is Freddie New. He is the general counsel over at The Little Car, and from a Bitcoin perspective, he's head of policy at Bitcoin Policy UK. So Freddie, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Stefan. Like I said, huge honor to be on. I've been a long-time fan, so it's kind of weird to be talking to you, but appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're doing some great work. I've seen you're, doing some work out there in terms of advocating for Bitcoin policy and, of course, helping people stay up to date on what's going on in, Bitcoin and regulatory affairs in the UK and in Europe and these things. So just take a minute and, give the listeners a background on yourself and who you are, what you're doing in the world of Bitcoin.
Of course. Rough background. I started off as an M&A lawyer. Did a lot of private equity and venture capital work, and also a lot of restructuring and insolvency work during the financial crisis, which is, as you can imagine, was a lot, very interesting, if a bit hairy. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I moved into the business side of things. So I still practice law, but now in businesses, and those are mainly startup businesses with a slant towards fintech and engineering. So like you said, my main job is as general counsel at an electric vehicle company. We make very high-powered models of classic cars like the Bentley, Ferrari, Aston Martin DB5. Lots of customers in Dubai, coincidentally, as you'd expect. Oh, and then also on the side, I did a lot of work over a number of years for a UK fintech called Curve. And I was instrumental in assisting to launch their Bitcoin product a few years back. And as part of that, I ended up doing a large amount of advocacy and feedback for government consultations in the UK. We're going to get into this during the conversation, but we are very much behind a lot of the rest of the world in our understanding of Bitcoin. And there's a huge level of confusion here between Bitcoin and crypto. Please, Stefan, let me know if you prefer me not to swear, and I won't use the colloquial term for other cryptos. if you don't want me to. And during part of that process, I came to realize that there was no one really in the UK speaking solely for Bitcoin. There was a lot of, as it were, altcoin marketing, but no one really focusing on Bitcoin. And following the Bitcoin conference in Edinburgh, which some of your listeners may have attended or be aware of, a bunch of us got together and decided we would pull together a Bitcoin-focused policy group in the UK advocating for only Bitcoin. And we were the first of our kind.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, I think there's a lot of things to get into, as you said, the regulatory environment in the UK, as well as I know there was the ECB, recently came out with some nonsense about Bitcoin. And I know you were part of the response, so we'll get into that later. But let's start on the UK regulatory side. Can you give us a bit of a background? What has the history of Bitcoin related, regulatory affairs looks like in the UK?
Of course, I think it's worth starting quite far back in the past. And I think as context for that, it's worth noting that the UK in many senses is quite an ossified country. And I think this feeds into a lot of different aspects of why there's such a misunderstanding of Bitcoin here. And by ossified, I mean it's very hard to affect change and to build things in the UK, which may strike some people as a bit of a surprise. Back in the 80s, the city of London went through what was known as the Big Bang, which was a big period of financial deregulation, and a lot of innovative finance products were invented and created and run out of London in that time. And London historically has had a fantastic reputation and great opportunities for financial creativity, effectively. But over the years, I think the UK has become over-regulated in some areas and sort of under-regulated in others. So an example of this ossification is our inability to build physical things. You may have heard of HS2 High Speed 2. It's a railway that they were attempting to build between London and Birmingham. They've spent £60 billion and haven't built more than about 10 miles of that railway. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it turns out it's not going to be built at all. And I think the same thing is becoming true of what used to be our financial expertise as well in London. And I think part of this is because London has historically been so sophisticated, for example, in terms of its adoption of securitization or its dominance of the Eurodollar market in the recent past. If things were invented adjacent to London, then they were leapt upon, and our bankers recognized rightly they could make a lot of money out of them, and went ahead to do so. One of the issues with Bitcoin is that there is an element of extraordinarily intellectual superiority among those people who work in the city. And I'm sure you've encountered this multiple times yourself. It seems utterly incomprehensible to these people that something invented by an anonymous cypherpunk could have the power and value and meaning and significance that Bitcoin actually does have. And in many ways, talking to these people, and I come from the same world. I worked in the City of London for 12 years, and my investors are there, and et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very difficult in many cases to get over the weird hump that no one knows who Satoshi was, which I find a lot of them are bizarrely obsessed by. Sorry, there's a long scene setting to your initial question.
What? That kind of reminds me of it's like in the modern day world when it's less about getting things done. It's more about who you are, what's your identity, do you kind of comply with do you hold the right views, right? This kind of luxury beliefs kind of idea, like it's kind of related to these ideas. And I think I'm also thinking a lot of Croesus or Jesse's infamous article, Why the Yuppie Elite Dismissed Bitcoin, right? I think it's that exact what we're talking about. And this professional, quote unquote, professional class, it exists all around the world, right? But obviously New York, London, Sydney, these places, like they have this kind of professional class, and you need to sort of come from the right pedigree. And I think that's why this identity question of who is Satoshi, it matters so much, because unless Satoshi attended, Oxford, they don't care.
Yeah, well, I went to Cambridge actually, so even I don't tick that box. But I think you make an excellent point. And I quote that Croesus article all the time because I think he hit it bang on. He is also from that kind of world, and his friends are the same. And the funny thing is, I'm relatively rare, although there are more and more of my type of person entering the Bitcoin space. For a long time, the career risk, I think, was associated for finance professionals with identifying Bitcoin as something that had value. But over the last 18 months, and we'll get into more details as we chat, I've seen more and more serious finance professionals in the UK coming out and describing what they're doing with Bitcoin, why it has value, why it's important. Maybe this is a good point to start talking through the history of how the regulators and the politicians have seen it.
Let's get into that. Like, if you could walk us through, like, what were they kind of initially viewing Bitcoin as, and and then I guess maybe the stablecoin conversation as well. Like, where did they kind of place things there, and then what's today? If you could walk 100%. Us through some of that.
Sure. So potted history, as it may not surprise you to hear that initially the message was Bitcoin is for criminals, and it's an unbacked crypto asset which has no intrinsic value. So all of the usual buzzwords. The first significant piece of evidence that we submitted was actually to a parliamentary committee, the Treasury Committee. I think I wrote about 10,000 words on that piece, and I know they read my piece because I was quoted in their report. Unfortunately, the committee at the time consisted of people who were aptly described by Croesus in Why the Yuppie Elite Dismissed Bitcoin, and their report concluded that Bitcoin should be regulated as gambling, that it had no value whatsoever, but people should be free to gamble on it. Funnily enough, that would have been great for Bitcoin holders because gambling wins in the UK are tax exempt. So there would have been no capital gains tax payable at that point. There's been a significant shift, though, in understanding since that initial report came out. So we've written a large number of papers, and our initial pushback to that included some wording which has now, funnily enough, found its way into legislation that's before Parliament, which we see as a significant win. That was in conjunction with some very thorough work done by the Law Commission. Now, in the UK, the Law Commission is a body of lawyers who look at changing habits, changing social mores, and so on, and they recommend changes to the law. As context, in the UK, historically, there have been two different types of property. You may be familiar with these yourself. But just to recap, there was a rather old-fashioned word called a chosen action, which is something like a contract that gives you rights you can enforce, and that can be a type of property. And the other type of property is a chosen possession, a thing in possession, which is an asset, a table, a chair, something like that. And in our initial response to the gambling report from the Treasury Commission, we said, no, Bitcoin is an actual thing. It is a form of property which is completely new and unique and unlike anything that we've seen before. And our existing legal framework doesn't really have the vocabulary to describe that. And then, much to our surprise, this type of thinking found its way into the Law Commission's report. And even more to our surprise, because as a Bitcoiner, you tend to be more pessimistic about the ability of politicians to understand this stuff. We found a piece of legislation just a couple of months ago put before Parliament to recognise, yes, digital assets such as Bitcoin can be a real thing, and they should also be protected under the law. And they should have the same protection as your car or your house or any other form of property, which is a significant step forward. And I think that's an indication that although a lot of politicians may be struggling with their understanding, the lawyers are, perhaps for the first time ever, are slightly ahead of the game here. I know people like to dump on lawyers, but I think they came through here for us. So I think that's a nice step in the right direction.
Yeah, so I guess just to get the timelines here, so that gambling report, when was that, and when, could you give us the timeline there?
Sure. So our submissions were written in summer 22, and the full report came out about 9 months later. The Law Commission report came out later that same year, so the gambling report was early 23. Law Commission report came out mid-23, late 23. So it's taken about a year for that to feed through into legislation, which came out in summer 24. So in some ways, quite a big change in quite a short time.
Yeah, and I can imagine, like, even in early, because I was wondering actually what was the view even, let's say, in 2013 or 2017 in those times. I'm curious if you kind of had, if you know, or if you don't.
I can give you almost a direct quote, actually. So there was an MP in Parliament back in 2014, which I think was the first time that Bitcoin was mentioned in Parliament. And it's worth actually looking up his speech. He's a guy called Steve Baker. He's a...
Oh, yeah, I've known him.
Yeah, you'd get on. He's libertarian, free market here. He's very interested in personal liberty and personal freedom. And he gave what I think was the first speech about Bitcoin in Parliament, largely in the context of the national debt, which is also something that we've been hammering recently. The fundamental understanding that our national liabilities are unsupportable without gigantic amounts of money printing, and that the consequence of that is obviously devaluation of the currency, and therefore looking at hard assets that cannot be diluted or issued at a whim by government is increasingly important. And yeah, Baker gave a fantastic speech on this in 2014. Of course, he was completely ignored at the time because Bitcoin is this funny computing thing. And I think that's another thing worth flagging. There's a strange antipathy towards technology in the United Kingdom. It's a combination of extraordinary arrogance on the one hand, pretending that the UK is somehow going to be world-beating in AI, while at the same time we're shutting AI data centres in Scotland, or that we're going to be a clean energy innovator when it takes 10 years for us to connect wind farms to the national grid. I'm not quite sure why the Brits have this kind of attitude. It's a source of perennial amusement and interest to me, but maybe you have some ideas. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you would know better than me. I'm an Australian, but I think we've seen this shift over time that, maybe some governments kind of ignored Bitcoin, and then at one point there was sort of, it's gambling, or maybe I remember in, let's say, 2014, 15 days, it was all, blockchain technology, right? So there was this kind of idea. And then 2017, there was a lot of shitcoins, and what we've seen is kind of a lot of the quote unquote crypto sort of advocacy groups would come out and advocate for, the right to scam or the right to shitcoin. And then sort of Bitcoin has been sort of treated like an also ran. And then I think I mean, some of that is probably touching on why you and the guy started Bitcoin Policy UK. But nevertheless, even though there are, shitcoiners trying to scam and whatever, there are a lot of shitcoiners who also hold Bitcoin and they also advocate for Bitcoin. So it's kind of it's not like a total enemy relationship there, right? At times you're pushing the same direction, right?
Exactly. I think that's a really good point to make. And actually, it's worth flagging a couple of areas where we do share some interests with these guys as well. So one is access to banking services. So one wedge area that we've been pushing the government on is to ensure that banks don't close businesses' accounts if they are involved in the cryptocurrency industry. And often that includes Bitcoin and other coins as well. And to ensure that individuals are free to use their bank accounts to buy coins on exchanges. And inevitably, in the case, if you've got a regular person using Coinbase, there's going to be shit coins on Coinbase as well, as we well know. So in some areas, we can align with the crypto body here, which is imaginatively called Crypto UK. But we've made it clear to them that, we're Bitcoin only. In some areas, we're pushing at the same door. In some areas, we're not. And the way that we as an organization tend to categorize it is that, Bitcoin is money. It's a new kind of money. It's a unique kind of money, and it's important for the government to understand that. Other coins we tend to categorize as venture-backed tech companies, and some of them may fail, some of them may not fail. That's how the startup culture is supposed to work. But they'll have a team, they'll have a foundation, they'll have airdrops in the same way that a VC-backed company would have early offerings of shares to a small pool of investors who will be at an advantage over later investors. So we try to distinguish Bitcoin from other kind of cryptocurrencies without being rude about them, although obviously we would secretly love to be. But
yeah. And I want to also touch on something you mentioned earlier around the bank accounts, right? So in the US conversation, people know this as Operation Choke Point 2.0. They also know this as, okay, the US government, it's come out now that the Biden administration basically attacked Silvergate and Signature and shut them down, that they weren't necessarily, that they didn't necessarily need to be stopped. I'm curious, are there parallels in the UK as well around banking access being shut off for Bitcoin or crypto exchanges and Bitcoin companies in the UK?
There are. So Danny Scott of Coin Corner is on record. He's spoken about HSBC many times in the past, his difficulties with them. A key problem we have in the UK at the moment is that many banks will not allow you to transfer money onto an exchange in order to make a purchase. And that's something that we flagged. I flagged this directly to the City Minister, to the Economic Secretary of the Treasury. I spoke about this in Parliament to the all-party parliamentary group. And then I followed that up with written submissions to the APPG, setting out which banks were friendly, which banks were not. A very interesting way that some exchanges in the UK are getting around this restriction is that they are actually setting up e-money accounts. So you're probably aware that many fintechs are able to use e-money accounts which are in your own name. So if I wanted to transfer money to myself, using an e-money account to the bank, it looks like a transfer to myself. And, it's entirely legitimate. It's lawful in the UK to hold cryptocurrency, to hold Bitcoin. It's lawful to buy it. There's no sense in which a bank should be restricting you from doing so. Taking a bit of a step back, though, one of the reasons that the banks have been doing this is not because they really hate cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. It's actually because it's self-preservation. So there's a type of fraud that is called authorized push payment fraud, or APP fraud. And until recently, the banks could, in each instance, be on the hook for several £100,000 per instance of APP fraud. So if I'd transferred money to a scammer, called on my bank and said, this was an APP fraud instance, the bank would be on hook for a large amount of money. They'd have a significant financial exposure. Interestingly, that threshold has just been dropped down to below 100,000. I think it's going to be about 85k, and that change will be coming in shortly. So I'm curious to see whether banks will become a bit looser in their enforcement of that restrictive policy, because their own financial exposure to losses will be less. So funnily enough, although that was often hitting attempted purchases of Bitcoin, I don't personally think that it was directed at Bitcoin specifically. I think it was more out of a fear of loss for the banks because they were on risk effectively.
Yeah. Now I'm curious. So yeah, certainly there's that fraud risk that the bank has to watch out for, and certainly there are cases where maybe it's like elderly abuse, or there's cases where like an older person who's not tech savvy, they've been scammed into something, and they've like the scammer is trying to walk them through, hey, send your money to this crypto exchange, buy Bitcoin and send it to me, etc. That kind of thing. And so there are cases where Bitcoin and crypto exchanges are trying to stop that particular type of scamming and fraud, and maybe the bank involved in that process is also saying, hey, we want to try to not facilitate this kind of scamming. So obviously, okay, fair enough. There's the other element, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the whole AML and sanctions regime, right? Anti-money laundering sanctions, etc. So I can imagine a lot of banks, maybe they're worried on that angle too. They're worried that they might be inadvertently, dragged into the net or sort of seen to be, quote unquote, allowing money laundering because they allowed, certain Bitcoin and crypto exchanges to, use that bank account to facilitate the fiat side of that transaction. Is that, I presume that's also part of the hesitance that some UK banks have with Bitcoin companies, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and it's potentially an issue. I would tend to counter that if I was advising the banks by the fact that virtually every exchange you'll be using will have KYC'd you to the eyeballs. And if you're transferring money to Coinbase know exactly who you are. They've seen a copy of your driving license, your passport. And in fact, I'd kind of go on the offensive there and say if there's any concern about you using your Coinbase account to avoid sanctions, then you're being pretty damn stupid, because you'd be using a KYC account that has your home address, your passport. You'd automatically be linking an on-chain address to your identity, and if you're then transferring money from your Coinbase account to a sanctioned entity, it's cut and dried. You've just done the cops' work for them. All they need to do is demonstrate that you have used that address to transfer funds to a sanctioned entity, and they don't even need to get out of bed before they can put a charge sheet together. So I think I'd go on the attack there and focus on the transparency of the ledger as being helpful to law enforcement. I've said before, only stupid criminals use Bitcoin. You're creating a permanent, unalterable record of your transactions that is completely public and which is admissible as evidence in court. Why on earth would you do that? And that's why only 0.34% of all Bitcoin transactions, as far as we know, according to the latest data, are used for illicit purposes. If you want to evade sanctions, use JP Morgan.
Right, and I am also curious on so I mean, there's a few things that kind of go into that, because on one side of it, there's like the privacy focused Bitcoin community, and they might be using things like CoinJoin and things like this to try to obfuscate the chain in terms of what the past transactions are. But then at the same time, there's the regulated world. And the regulated world, let's say banks and Bitcoin and crypto exchanges that are, above board and KYC, will sort of be in a different position where they will have to sort of prove to their regulator, oh, look, yes, Mr. Regulator, I've got this AML program, or I've got this, that, I'm ticking this box and that box and so on. Not saying I like it, of course. I'm against AML regulations in general as a libertarian, but I'm just trying to characterize the world as it is today. Yeah. And so I think that's probably where maybe one aspect of the tension is. And so where do you think that's going to end up going? Do you see that like the state is going to try to go harder and sort of expect more AML compliance, or do you sort of see it like things are going to stay in this current period, stay at the current level?
Yeah, if I had to guess, I would say that exchanges are probably going to become more and more like banks. And it's going to be interesting to see whether more and more banks are able to hold Bitcoin on behalf of their customers. I think there's an increasing level of hybridization going to take place. We're already seeing that with banks such as Zappo, which is available in the UK. That's obviously a regulated bank. You can hold a bank account with them and you never need to touch Bitcoin at all, or you can purchase Bitcoin on their platform and hold it. What seems to be happening, certainly in the UK, is, and more so in Europe, and we might get into this if we have time to touch on MICA, the marketing crypto asset regulation that has come into force in Europe. There was a bit of a concern around what they call unhosted wallets, and which the rest of us, call wallets or UTXOs. And the fix they seem to be implementing is that a transfer off a regulated platform that has done AML and KYC on you to an on-chain address outside the platform will require you to provide information about the person to whom you're transferring it. Now, 99 times out of 100, that's going to be yourself to cold storage or to your own hot wallet. And what I've seen in terms of the reviews that we've done of different transfers out from the various exchanges is that really is as simple as you doxing the first step off the exchange. Now, as we both know, that will potentially dox all of your other addresses that you may transfer to from that initial step. But most of the exchanges at the moment seem to be requiring only a doxing of yourself, effectively. So you say, yes, who are you transferring this to? I'm transferring it to myself. Do I own and control this address? Yes, I do. And that is how the banks cover their own backs, basically. They can then demonstrate to the regulator that they took prudent steps to ensure that they found out who the person was transferring the money to, and it was themselves. So I think that's probably what the world we're going to end up in.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKite.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices, such as the Cold Card Mark IV and the new Cold Card Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now, you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck as a few examples. Now, you have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases, you can use seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. The lead sponsor of this show is Bold, the best place to buy, sell, and save Bitcoin. For listeners in the US, Bold lets you secure your financial future with complete peace of mind by integrating a low-fee, Bitcoin-only brokerage with next-gen multi-sig vaults. With Bold, you can smash buy Bitcoin or set a DCA plan for only 0.99% fees and seamlessly deposit the Bitcoin direct to your Bold Vault. The Bold Vault is a 2 of 3 collaborative multi-sig where you hold 2 keys and Bold holds 1 as a redundant backup, protecting against loss or theft. You can use Trezor, Ledger, or Cold Card hardware wallets to spin up a Bold Vault in just a few minutes, and the Bold Vault is the only collaborative custody vault available with 0 monthly fees. They're also offering 0 fees on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin buys and $25 of free Bitcoin when you buy $100 of Bitcoin or more. Try Bold today and upgrade your stacking experience over at getbold.io. Yeah, I see. And so, interestingly, I notice it depends on who you're talking to, right? Like if you're talking to someone like yourself or me who's kind of more hardcore about, self-custody and this kind of thing. But if let's go one tick out, there might be, or one notch out on the onion or whatever we're saying, there will be a lot of people who just use these, whether they use like Binance as a kind of neobank, right? They'll use it as, or as an example, if you go to some of these OTC traders, they might use some of these custodial platforms as a bank, kind of. So they'll take, when they want to sell when someone wants to sell some fiat, some stablecoin or Bitcoin for cash, they might just say, hey, transfer it to my whatever. They'll show you the QR code on their thing, and they'll just kind of use it like a bank. And it's not necessarily every exchange in and out is to and from their own wallet. It's actually they are trying to use it like a external transfer. So I'm curious what you make of that. Do you think that practice will shift, or that will have to change?
That's a really good question. I think that is worth looking at that through the lens of more mainstream adoption. I think you're completely right. A lot of people are not going to necessarily be playing around with hardware wallets. And I mean, without going too much into my own background, it took me a while before I did that myself as well. Obviously, I don't own any Bitcoin. I wish I did, and if I had bought any, I would be interested in in experimenting with hardware wallets. But I think if we're looking towards a world where everyone's grandmother has a Bitcoin option, I think in reality, we may need to admit that not everyone is going to be fiddling around with a hardware wallet, and some people are going to be using these services like banks. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I often go back to Hal Finney's comment, I think in 2010, about on-chain transactions being as rare in that world as they are today, where you have banks holding Bitcoin and final settlements being made in much the same way as final settlements made today at central banks between commercial banks. You get to the end of the day, and then there's a settlement process, and it doesn't necessarily all happen at once. There are concerns, obviously, around paper Bitcoin and so on, but I think that's a positive move towards adoption and recognition by large institutions that Bitcoin is real. A lot of Bitcoiners are sensitive about the involvement of large institutions, but Bitcoin is for individuals and institutions and alike. It's if we believe it's for everyone, then each of these different types of entity are going to use it in a different way. I think it's important to. Certainly, I admit that.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, as you said, I think it's kind of and I mean, I think Bitcoin mostly challenges central banking and government control of money. It doesn't necessarily challenge banking in general, right? I believe,
No.
I think banking will still exist. Of course, I want as many people to self-custody as possible, but I also recognize there are limits on how many can do that, right? I think the ballpark number is like 10 to 100 million in terms of on-chain users, even accounting with Lightning. So,
Exactly.
Until or someday, if the Bitcoin ecosystem comes to consensus on some kind of soft fork, or maybe it's a covenant thing, or I don't know, that's kind of the ballpark. So it implies that 100 million people can hold on-chain coins, but there'll be a lot of people in the future who are custodial users. Therefore, they are kind of like bank customers in a sense. But maybe that's in the future, and we'll sort of have to see. But for now, I mean, let's chat a little bit about, I guess, regulator attitudes and how that's shifted over time. And as I understand, in the UK, it's the FCA, right? Financial Conduct Authority, I believe it is. Yeah,
that's correct. It's worthwhile spending a bit of time on them. So they are probably the biggest blocker to a sensible adoption of Bitcoin in the United Kingdom at the moment. So as we mentioned already, the attitude of Parliament certainly seems to be shifting. The attitude of government is generally positive, although there's still a lot of confusion around the distinction between Bitcoin and crypto. We're working on educating them as to that distinction. It's useful you mentioned the underlying blockchain technology, because we still, to this day, hear a lot of that rubbish coming out of politicians. But, it's a learning process. And at some point, they'll realize the only good thing that blockchain technology is useful for, and come to the same understanding as we have. The FCA is a different kettle of fish, though. They are extraordinarily resistant to, firstly, recognition of Bitcoin as an asset at all. And they've taken a number of different steps over the past few years. I'd probably highlight two of those. The first is restriction of access to exchange-traded products. And the second is a very damaging categorization of Bitcoin for definitional purposes, which has a lot of knock-on effects for the asset and the industry. So touching on the first one initially, prior to, I think, about autumn 2020, retail investors in the UK could access exchange-traded products of one kind or another in their tax advantage wrappers.
I see. And sorry, just to be clear, when we're talking about, we're talking here similar to like an ETF or an ETN, this kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. So there were a couple of products. They weren't full exchange-traded funds, but they were synthetic instruments that offered exposure to Bitcoin. Back in 2020, the FCA outlawed the retail ownership of any such products. So you didn't have to sell them, but if you sold them, you couldn't buy back in. So an awful lot of people have been essentially frozen in their 2020 positions. Now, the FCA talk a lot about their regulation supposed to be preventing customer harm. And they came out with some bullshit calculation about how much financial damage they would have prevented by taking this step. Unfortunately, these poor individuals who are holding these instruments are, as I say, are completely locked in, and they are no longer the best instruments to hold in order to get Bitcoin exposure, whether holding Bitcoin itself or some of the new ETNs and ETFs that have recently been launched. Incredibly, in the UK, it's still not permitted for regular retail investors to have ETN or ETF exposure of any kind to anything that touches any form of crypto asset at all. So we've gone very hard on the city minister on this, saying that, firstly, it's absolutely outrageous. There's an extraordinarily logical inconsistency in the FCA being totally fine with people holding the underlying asset, but not holding a synthetic exchange-traded product that gives exposure to that asset. I spoke on this in Parliament as well, and it's, as far as we were aware, there's no other comparable instance of the underlying product being fine to hold, but a synthetic product not being okay to hold. Because to a traditional finance professional, the synthetic product looks safer. You've got insurance, you're holding it through a regulated entity that's done KYC and AML. Maybe it's BlackRock, maybe it's Valkyrie. It's utterly senseless to someone who works in finance that you should be able to hold this crazy digital beanie baby, but you can't hold an ETF issued by the biggest money manager in the world. So we find ourselves in this extraordinary position, and we've been working with a British fund called Jacobi Asset Management, who've offered the first European ETF. And they're a British company, but they've had to launch out of Jersey and list in Amsterdam because they can't list it in the UK. And we're tracking back to our earlier point around the UK being a hotbed of financial innovation and forward thinking. This completely undermines the UK's reputation for, looking for intelligent and innovative financial products to launch to the world. And I think the government's kind of on our side here. The FCA just absolutely will not budge. And unfortunately, the way that the regulator is set up in the UK is that the FCA is ostensibly independent and independently funded. So while the government can exert pressure, they can't actually have any impact on the decision-making process there. But I think at some point it's going to become politically untenable for them to continue with this kind of attitude, particularly when the kind of data we're getting out of the ETFs in the US is just so incredibly positive. I forget what the day after the election. What was the trading volume? Was insane, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, I can't remember the exact number, but I think some of the ETF commentators were saying, we had a big round of inflows again day after Trump was elected. And so I think, some of these things will change over time, right? I presume, coming back to our earlier point about the yuppie elite, they very much care about perceptions. And if the rest of the world is sort of moving on Bitcoin, if the US, if Trump comes into power, early next year or whenever, and he starts going hard on Bitcoin, or even Cynthia Lummis, Senator Lummis has been talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. If the US starts to move on that, or if other countries start to move on that, then the UK, surely these, regulators in the UK will then start to have to change their tune.
Exactly right, and I completely agree. We've done a lot of work this year on a more offense strategy. Last year, we spent a lot of time replying to consultations. This year, we've gone on the offense. And earlier in the year, we could see which way the wind was blowing, and we drafted a policy paper for the government on exactly this. That these things are likely to happen in the near future, and the UK needs to capitalise on its position fast. Did you know, for example, the UK is the third largest nation-state holder of Bitcoin on the planet, after the US and China?
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, it's number 3. It's ridiculous. It holds 61,000 coins.
Is this from like a criminal seizure theft, or like how did this happen?
Largely confiscations. So there were 2 or 3 smaller ones, and there was an absolute whale that they finally got the keys to last year, I believe.
Wow. Okay. Well, there you go. That's 61,000. And I think people were talking about how Germany, or it was one particular, state inside of Germany who sold this. There was a recent thing where they sold all these coins, and I think Joanna Qatar was trying to say this is a big mistake. You shouldn't have done this, but it's too late. I think it was Saxony. I think it's a German state name. But yeah.
Yeah. Have you seen they're already $1 billion down on their sale price?
Right. It's crazy. And, we're just getting started this cycle. So it's going to get even worse, right? I think, and, it reminds me, well, speaking of the UK, didn't Gordon Brown sell the gold just before gold went on a huge run up as well, right?
Exactly. I think I'm going to get the number wrong here, but he's in the ballpark of a $33 billion loss on that trade. So he sold at the Pico bottom. And if he'd held, that would have closed the famous black hole that our chancellor keeps on talking about in the public finances. But so we focus very much on self-interest. We said the UK has got an incredible first mover advantage here. It holds 61,000 coins as a result of confiscations. We should be doing something with that. At the point when the legal process has been completed and it's absolutely clear that there are no competing claims to those coins, the UK is in an extraordinary position, and it should be doing everything it can to maximize the value of that holding that it holds on behalf of the nation. I'll need to run the numbers on this, but I think I think that's increased by $500 million in just the last week, which is not to be sniffed at.
This show brought to you by mempool.space, the world's leading Bitcoin visualizer. And now they've got an accelerator program. So if you have a transaction that you sent at a fee that was too low to get confirmed, now you can fix this with the mempool accelerator. The way it works, you can go and search your transaction, scroll down, click accelerator, and you don't need an account. You can pay with Lightning, and then it'll show you it's now in the process of being accelerated, and then after a few minutes, it's confirmed. And so this is a great way to help you out if you are stuck. And this can happen where maybe your wallet doesn't have RBF or CPFP, or it might help you in situations where it's impractical to go and re-sign. So for example, multi-sig with keys in different locations. And thirdly, even in some Lightning scenarios, perhaps a forced close, you might not be able to use RBF. And so in this case, the mempool accelerator can help you out. So keep it in mind, and you can find out more over at mempool.space/accelerator. This show also brought to you by Nomad Capitalist. Nomad Capitalist is a leading provider in terms of offshore tax and lifestyle strategy planning and implementation. They can help you go overseas and legally lower your taxes. As many of you know, I grew up in Australia, but I left. I was sick of it in terms of the taxes and the COVID tyranny and all these other things. And so that's why I left, and now I live in Dubai. But that's not necessarily the place for you. You have to think exactly what works for you, for your family, for your business. And Nomad Capitalists have worked across dozens of different countries. They've helped people get passports, residences, bank accounts, and all kinds of other things. And importantly, it's not just about choosing one place. It may be multiple places. And it may be also about making the pieces fit together in terms of how your business fits with your family and you as an individual. Nomad Capitalists have helped many, many people in terms of going overseas. And if you're interested, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. This is applicable for people with a net worth above $1 million US. That's nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Yeah, it's a lot of coins. And I think this is an interesting point as well from the, let's say, libertarian perspective. I know my friend Pierre Rochard has been arguing that it's a good thing that states hold some Bitcoin. Now, yes, from a libertarian perspective, you could maybe argue on the short run it's a bad thing and that the state should not have to tax to acquire Bitcoin. But here we're talking about confiscation, a case of confiscation. And it's also a case where I think long term we can sort of agree that if states start holding Bitcoin, that eventually takes away their seigniorage and fiat currency creation powers, which is a long-term win for all of us. So I think, to me, it's very clear that if you can get states to, just in general, we want more people to hold Bitcoin, right? The more people who hold Bitcoin, there's safety in numbers. There's just a general kind of advancement of the movement. And so we will be further ahead in, Bitcoin's monetization process. I think that's kind of one way to think about that. So, the race is on, and I think we'll have to see whether the UK wants to be a leader or a laggard in this question. One other question while we're on this is, while we're on kind of the question about being able to, buy and sell Bitcoin, I know this is something I've heard, rumors, maybe you can clarify or clear this up for me. I've heard in some cases for UK Bitcoin exchanges, they need to kind of do this questionnaire of their customers to sort of make sure they kind of understand this, that, and the other about Bitcoin. And it sort of acts as another, let's say, friction to customers being able to actually just buy Bitcoin. This is for UK customers on a UK Bitcoin exchange.
It's good that you mentioned that. This was the second point around the FCA regulation that I wanted to touch on, actually. So we've spoken, obviously, on ETFs and ETN access. The second thing we're attacking them on is this daft categorization that they come up with. So there are various categorizations of investments in the UK that are set out by the FCA. And one of these is what's called a restricted mass market investment. Now, these can be offered to the public, but only under very limited circumstances and through a very strict set of loopholes. Previously, restricted mass market investments included things like shares in non-listed companies or complex loan products, peer-to-peer lending, wrapped instruments, so quite esoteric products. The FCA had a consultation last year to which we and most of the industry responded quite aggressively because they were proposing to categorize Bitcoin and all crypto assets as restricted mass market investments. Now, you can offer restricted mass market investments to the public, but in order to do so, you need to ensure that they know what they're buying, which is why the questionnaires that you've mentioned have been introduced. So on my Twitter, actually it's my pinned tweet, we've got a list of walkthroughs of the types of questionnaires that people in the UK are likely to be asked. If anyone's having trouble with their exchange, have a look at my pinned tweets. We've done a review of virtually every exchange that's available in the UK, setting out walkthroughs of all of the different questions if anyone's having trouble or issues with those. The reason exchanges are doing this is because, bluntly, they have to. They can't sell Bitcoin without people going through those questionnaires first. And if you're in the UK, you'll also notice an annoying banner ad on every single page of your app, which states, this is a very risky, volatile investment. You may lose all of the money that you invest. That, again, is thanks to the FCA, who have been utterly boneheaded in their approach to this. So what's particularly galling, if you read the FCA's report that they produced after the evidence was gathered, is they stated in black and white, the majority of the industry said that this definition was incorrect. So we've decided to go ahead and impose the definition anyway, which I find utterly flabbergasting. You know, why bother to ask the industry at all? I couldn't have said it better. It's completely ridiculous. I'm afraid that the FCA are run, I mean, your views on regulators are probably similar to mine. They are not run by the best and the best people. My view tends to be that if they were good people, they wouldn't be in a regulator. They'd be in a real job. But obviously, I shouldn't be terribly rude to them because I need to keep persuading them to listen to my point of view.
Yeah, to come around. Yeah, but I mean, nevertheless, I mean, this is you got to work in the system that you can. While of course, cypherpunks write code, and certainly, there's that element of it. But I also think, it's a good thing to try to engage and try to push the system in a more freedom and liberty direction. While we can. So we might as well do that. So I guess zooming out a little bit, what are some of your broader hopes on, let's say, Bitcoin policy UK? What are some of the main goals? Is it around things like, the right to self-custody, the right for mining or banking access? Do you have any high-level goals that you're trying to, achieve there?
Well, I'm worried you've been doing sort of background research on me because that's effectively our policy goals are almost exactly as you've listed. Number one is ensuring that self-custody and ownership of Bitcoin remains legal. And the piece of legislation I mentioned earlier is a fantastically powerful step in that direction. Second is free access to exchanges and access to banking services, so that in the hybrid world we live in, you can continue to buy and sell freely if you so desire, and you can move money from fiat to your exchange and back again without any friction. Thirdly, we again close to the mining point you made, we'd like the government at least to commence feasibility studies on the development of the mining industry in the UK. At the moment, the UK has less than 1% of the global hash rate, and we have an awful lot of curtailed wind energy, and that cannot be connected to the grid yet, or is simply burnt off and wasted. And touching again on one of the points I made earlier around the difficulty of building in the UK, one of the stumbling blocks there is that our planning regulations very seldom allow for mixed use. For example, co-location of a data center with a wind farm. Those are two different categories of construction and building. And at the moment, the mining industry looks at the UK and says, "Oh, it's just not worth bothering. The regulation is too intense." And so there's a lot of free wind power being burnt off, which in many cases the taxpayer is paying for. Just last year, for example, in Scotland, we curtailed 1 million homes worth of electricity from wind power alone, which is utterly idiotic. And there's a buyer for that electricity out there, and we'd like to educate the government on that. And zooming out even further, our key aim is that every person in the UK and worldwide as well should have the opportunity to save, to hold, and to use a non-state issued money that no government or central bank can dilute or debase. That's really key for us.
Yeah. And one other one I might just add, I'm curious if this has come up in the UK conversations at all around, for my developer listeners and friends out there, is there anything in terms of the right to develop, right? This is something, it's become a conversation as well with the cases of Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash. Is there anything there that can be done to sort of preserve the right for Bitcoin developers and whether they are protocol or application developers in the UK?
Obviously, we don't have as well developed constitutional protection for free speech in the UK, but it's better than people might think. And we look at this a lot in the context of CBDCs. You may guess that we're not a fan. There are two particular articles of interest to the CBDC effort. One Article 8 on privacy, but the one I think of more relevance to your question is Article 10, and that's the right, the right to free speech. And the way that Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights is drafted, which is incorporated into English law as well through the Human Rights Act, the way that is worded, that includes the free transmission and receipt of information, and that definition of information is not restricted. So in some senses, that's very broadly similar to the constitutional protections for the creation of speech, which, as we know, has also been applied to code. So although this hasn't been tested to the same extent it has in the United States, I think there's definitely a human rights argument to be made under Article 10 for the protection of the transmission and receipt of information, which would include code. So
I see. So hypothetically, if a UK Bitcoin developer were to be sued, you might be able to find some protection there for them.
Potentially. And, a lot of this will come down to funding. So in order to argue that case, you would need to instruct really good lawyers. Bluntly, the community, we would need to step up and assist to fund those kind of efforts. One area where the UK has been lagging is in bluntly funding for those kind of efforts. The US, as in most things, is far ahead of us here. They have a large number of well-funded and well-resourced lobby groups and PACs. Our organization operates on a shoestring. We're all volunteers. We do this in our spare time because we think it's important. And I think if we see arrests and charges brought in the UK, we're going to need to organize some financial backing to defend those persons. Article 10, I think, is a useful area to explore in terms of a developer's rights to create and impart and receive information. And that's probably the angle I would attack.
Gotcha. Now, we've been talking a lot about the regulatory side of it. What about on the political and legislative side of it? Now, maybe you could explain a little bit. I don't know how much you've engaged with, let's say, the political parties of the UK on Bitcoin. Are there, we've seen Trump recently elected in the US. Is there any hope in the British or the UK political parties, or maybe is it like you're hoping for like a Farage or something to sort of be more pro, Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, not being rude, I think a lot of the politicians in the UK have been caught with their pants down by what's happened in the US over the last few months. We flagged to the Chancellor the importance of the Bitcoin conference last year. Not only did we have Trump speaking, we had Vivek, and we also had RFK. It's significant looking at the likely members of Trump's cabinet, how many of them hold and are interested in Bitcoin. You mentioned Senator Lummis earlier. It's funny you said that. I've actually seen, just in the last 24 hours, a draft of her piece of legislation pushing for the strategic reserve. And, she's been tweeting about that just in the last few hours. So we are in dialogue with the city minister on the importance of Bitcoin, and we have made ourselves available to advise them if they realize their pants are down and, perhaps they'd like to pull them up and get into the room on this. What we've suggested are, very, very simple pieces of policy changes, things like an amendment to tax policy, that such as was recommended by the Lummis and Gillibrand bill, which had a de minimis level of, I think, $200, below which you would be able to freely transact without creating a taxable event. Germany have a very forward-thinking tax policy, which is that if you hold the asset for a year, so if you buy Bitcoin, hold it for a year, you can then transact freely with it without, again, causing a taxable event. So we need to demonstrate, perhaps by the production of data, that free movement of money within the economy is generally good both for businesses and for people, and will ultimately lead to more positive financial and fiscal outcomes than an aggressive tax policy, which, as we know in many cases, will simply act as a throttle on further economic activity. That's a harder argument to make to the Labour Party, but there are sympathetic people in the party that we are reaching out to. You mentioned Nigel Farage. He, I think, already holds Bitcoin. So, he's an interesting character because to some in the UK, he's still relatively toxic. To others, he is an absolute hero. So depends which group of people you want to get on board. One sensitivity we're particularly aware of is that we don't want Bitcoin to become a political partisan issue. Like we said earlier, our view is very much that Bitcoin is for everyone, whether you're a libertarian or a communist. Everyone should be allowed to hold it. And we don't want it to be for one party or for another. But however, our arguments in relation to the Labour Party are more in terms of, for example, the humanitarian use cases or the or financial unfairness. The latest data, for example, from the FCA show that there are more than 1 million people in the UK, adults, who still don't have a bank account. And very often that's because they don't have necessary KYC, they don't have a fixed address. They're excluded from the financial system. They can be included if and to the extent they're able to use Bitcoin. So that, I think, from a financial fairness and inclusion point of view, is an argument that could appeal. And again, there's a lot of interesting work to be done on the mining industry's capability for, let's say, mitigating landfill methane emissions, or, as we've said a couple of times during the pod, integration with renewable wind energy.
I see, yeah. So yeah, lots of things. I did want to save a little bit of time to touch on your ECB response also. So we should cover some of that.
Yeah.
Are you able to go a little bit over, or do you have a hard stop?
No, I'm good.
Okay, well then let's chat about it. So, I know the ECB recently came out, and I believe there were two consultants. What's his name? Jürgen Schaaf, and I forgot the other guy's name.
Incel.
Right. And so... Yeah, and so they came out with, they were basically, these are like the typical arguments. Oh, it's volatile. And now they were trying to sort of say, as I read them, they were trying to make an argument about wealth concentration, right? So it was this kind of inequality sort of argument. Do you want to just talk a little bit about your response that you were a part of?
Yeah, sure. So giving you a bit of background, these guys, they're two of my favorite people in the world ever. I call them the most consistently wrong men at the ECB. Every time is just ridiculous. So I first encountered them in November 2022 when they released a paper for the ECB called Bitcoin's Last Stand. That came out on November 30th, 2022. So for anyone with a memory longer than about 5 minutes will remember that was the absolute bottom after the FTX debacle. And if you bought Bitcoin in November 2022, you've made out like an absolute bandit.
You're laughing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They could not have timed it worse. I mean, my main message about these guys is, just look back at their track record. They absolutely have no idea what the hell they are talking about. But they keep on doing this. So that was fun. And then when the ETFs came out, when the approval happened in January this year, they released another paper called the Bitcoin, the Emperor's New Clothes. No, sorry, the Naked Emperor's New Clothes. They probably didn't realize that this title was already in use. It had been used by it was a pornographic novel under the title "The Emperor's New Clothes," which I hesitate to recommend to everyone, but it's pretty funny that they used the same title. This was saying that even though there are ETFs, this doesn't legitimize Bitcoin, and it's still rubbish, and everyone will lose all of their money. Obviously, as we know, if you bought the ETFs in January, you've done pretty well by now. But these guys, they love punishment, so they decided to release this new paper, which, as you rightly point out, was essentially around the unfairness of Bitcoin. And the gist of their argument was that if the price of Bitcoin keeps going up forever, as it inexplicably seems to be doing, this will be really unfair, and it will disadvantage everyone who buys later. And astonishingly, they actually said that people should lobby their governments for legislation that would restrict ownership of or ban Bitcoin completely. And aside from the fact that, as we know, that's completely impossible to do, it's pretty extraordinary that you've got two economists working for a central bank who are fundamentally making an argument that just because you, as an investor, took risk early on, in the full knowledge that you might have lost all of your money, in exactly the same way as if you'd been an investor in Apple's IPO or Google's IPO in the early 2000s, you took risk on those companies, and you should, I'm an economic libertarian as well. I believe you take risk, you get rewarded. It's extraordinary to hear that kind of argument from two ostensible economists. So there was a lot of kerfuffle around this, and I wrote a few lengthy tweets on it. And Dennis Porter's a friend. He and I had a call, had that in the diary anyway, and he mentioned that he was pulling together a paper, and would I like to chip in? So I jumped at the chance. It was very fun. Worked with Murray, who's one of his academic advisors. Worked with Alan Farrington, and we essentially went through the fundamentally intellectually dishonest viewpoints in this article and tore them to smaller shreds as we could.
Right. So so I think it's interesting you point out the point around risk, right? Because this is like a common sort of leftist worker exploitation argument you'll hear. They'll sort of say this idea of, the entrepreneur is earning this, this higher amount, but he's only paying the worker this lesser amount, and therefore it's exploitation. They're neglecting this kind of aspect of risk, and they're neglecting the aspect of time, right? This aspect of the entrepreneur was putting in this money early, and it was uncertain that he would make a profit. That's the nature of being an entrepreneur in the market. And so it's a similar thing even with Bitcoin. And as you said, it's similar with if you had bought Microsoft stocks or Apple stocks or Google stocks or Tesla stocks or Nvidia stocks in the early days. Yeah, it was, it wasn't as sure of a bet as it is now. So obviously it's a different thing. But it's funny that they're sort of flipping their criticism. In one way, it's like, it's all over for Bitcoin in 2022, and now it's going to take over the world, so the government better come in to stop it. So it's sort of like they can't even get their story straight, right?
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important always to go back and look at what people said previously and how and why their arguments have changed. And this is true for everything, not just Bitcoin, but it's, again, I spend a lot of time trying to think my way into these people's heads. They obviously hate and loathe and fear Bitcoin. They don't want it. They believe that central banks should be the only entities to create money. Obviously, as we know, commercial banks create the majority of money in the economy every time they make loans. But they want central banks to be the only entity that is setting monetary policy and giving commercial banks those powers. And again, tracking back to something we said at the beginning of the conversation, it's very, very difficult for these kind of people to understand that something else might have that power, and there is a neutral protocol which has its own monetary policy set in stone that they can't affect. it's very, very hard for them intellectually to comprehend that. And I don't know if you ever read The Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle, a piece of sci-fi.
Oh, no.
It's about this gigantic alien intelligence that makes contact with Earth, and at a crucial point in the book, it's a benign intelligence. It tries to communicate with one of the human characters, and the amount of information that it downloads into his brain is such that he has a colossal aneurysm, and his brain literally fries itself. It's effectively what's happening to these people. They cannot understand why Bitcoin exists and why it has value, and the level of their incomprehension is such that they can't even they don't even have the intellectual humility to step back and ask themselves, if I think Bitcoin is so worthless, why do people keep adopting it, and why does the price keep going up? Their only answer is
it feels very. Yeah, it just feels very out of touch, similar to the way, let's say, the legacy media are treating some of the elections nowadays. They're unable to sort of have let's say, a theory of mind of other people. And so they're unable to sort of understand why they think a certain way. And they're sort of used to being able to sort of command the world from their ivory tower. And they're coming from this kind of technocratic mindset where they think, it's kind of mother knows best, but they're not actually your mother, right? They're just, they think they have the right to sort of determine what should the money of the world be. It's just a very, it's just the wrong mindset and not really understanding the world for how it really is. And so it's a real shame, but at the same time, it's good that you guys got a good rebuttal out there. And I mean, it was very quick rebuttal as well, because sometimes these messages, it needs a quick rebuttal, because as the saying goes, the lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets his pants on, or whatever it is. So
exactly, we leapt to it and got it out quickly. And I think maybe sort of tying it back to politicians' attitudes, what you said there, I think, is fundamentally very important. A lot of these guys are operating in a world where they can call up the CEO of a bank and ask for a transaction to be frozen. So one of our absolutely key messages to everyone we deal with, whether that's regulators or politicians, is that Bitcoin doesn't function like that. You cannot stop me from signing a transaction other than by physical force. And at some point, that transaction is going to be swept out of the mempool and mined into a block, and it will become true for the purposes of the Bitcoin ledger. And getting them to understand that they live in a new world, I think that's the gating item. Once we can get over that hurdle, and then so this is reality. How do I then respond to that reality? At the moment, a lot of them haven't comprehended that reality has changed.
Yeah. So I know you're obviously more focused on the UK, but I'm sure you have some thoughts on how the EU regulation and the EU approach is going. Can you contrast that for us a little bit? Like, where are the main differences in UK regulatory environment and the EU regulatory environment?
I think the key one I'd highlight is a bit of a focus on mining and energy. So we've already mentioned MiCA. That's short for the Market in Crypto Assets Regulation. I'm generally not a fan of regulation of this kind, but as regulations go, it's not a bad piece of regulation. They've consulted with the industry. It's very thorough. It aims effectively to legitimize the industry for regulatory purposes. However, they have a bee in their bonnet around energy use and the extent to which they pay attention to the realities of Bitcoin. As Troy Cross, I think, calls it a dung beetle, isn't it? Bitcoin is not a competitor for energy in the open market because it can't afford to be. The cost of production of Bitcoin is such that it can't compete with you or I as domestic buyers of electricity. They will only buy electricity that is cheap enough for them to make a profit, and if not, they switch off. And in addition to that, so the usage of only wasted energy, there's an important message around the extent to which Bitcoin can use methane. And as we know, methane is 80 times worse than carbon dioxide as a warming gas. And, the key pieces of work that we've done as regards to the EU are on mining. So as part of the MiCA implementation efforts, there was a drive to force different crypto asset businesses to disclose how much energy their crypto asset uses. We again went on the offence here to disclose the negative environmental effects of their crypto asset. We went on the offence and said, well, if you're disclosing the negative environmental impact, let's also request disclosure of the positive impact, and then we wrote an extremely long paper detailing in an aggressive level of detail exactly how many positive impacts there were. If you're going to try ban mining for environmental reasons, here are all the reasons you shouldn't ban it for environmental reasons. So try to use some of their arguments against them in that context. So I think there is a risk in the in the EU. Norway's obviously not an EU country. It's part of EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. They are increasingly aggressively pushing to ban mining in their jurisdiction. If they do that, then it's likely that mining will move to less clean forms of energy. So one of the arguments that when we're in contact with various of the teams in Norway who are working on these responses, we've given some feedback to them ourselves in support. One of the arguments there is that if you care about the environment, Norway's production of electricity is largely pretty clean, as was Iceland's. And if you ban mining in your jurisdiction, you're actually going to increase carbon emissions. So if you're worried about carbon emissions, keep the industry.
So I think the renewable policy in the EU is perhaps hindering, or at least the approach on Bitcoin and their kind of the way they're approaching Bitcoin mining is hindering them. But let's see what can be done there, whether that can be turned around. And also, I just got reminded there was one other thing. I'm curious if you have any insight into this or any knowledge on this. But I know there was a UK pension fund that recently allocated 3% of their assets into Bitcoin. I believe it was advised by Cartwright. Do you know anything about that, or? Yeah, I
know a little. So Cartwright they're very good friends of ours, very supportive. They have a great team, very hardcore Bitcoiners. I'm sure you'd get on with them personally. I won't name any names, but we've been in touch with them for a while on this, and they're a solid shop. They've done really thorough research on this. And they advise, I think, 10 pension funds. And the first one, I believe, has just made that 3% allocation. So we're very supportive of this effort. It's fantastic news. And in fact, a bunch of our team were at an event with Cartwright just last night, where coincidentally they were showing Dirty Coin, also to Steve Baker, who I mentioned earlier. So
right, it's all full circle. Yeah,
triple whammy. So they are very good people. They are the kind of finance professionals that I mentioned earlier in the chat. That's we want to showcase as much as we can, and whose efforts we support. I think the biggest problem is that if you only have a 3% allocation, we're going to see sales of Bitcoin in the future in order to keep that allocation at 3%.
Yeah, and unfortunately, 3% is a very small allocation. But of course, I mean, everything has to start small for a lot of people. Sometimes they need to proverbially dip their toe in the water. So I understand that. But I would say for people who are considering allocation, you want to make sure you've got enough Bitcoin that you can really feel the upside when it comes. So that's something everyone has to obviously make their own decision based on what they're able to. What kind of volatility are you willing to stomach? Because as we all know, Bitcoin is volatile, so that's part of what it is. So look, let's finish up on this. What can people do if they want to help you guys out, especially for any UK Bitcoiner listeners? What can they do to help you out at Bitcoin Policy UK?
Awesome. I'd suggest 2 or 3 things. So we've got 2 Giza funds going. One is to raise money to deliver books to politicians in Parliament. We just bought the first tranche of those. It's actually an anti-CBDC book, but of relevance to Bitcoin as well. We're tailoring delivery of those books dependent on politicians' political leanings. So either the Bitcoin Standard, for example, or also the Progressive's Guide to Bitcoin, depending on which politician. Second Giza fund is for raising money to buy old miners, and we're using those in educational products in schools, and also to explore waste heating applications, and again to produce case studies which we can put in front of regulators and governments and politicians to explain the side benefits of having a mining industry in the country. The UK is a cold place. Lots of us need to heat our homes. There's a potential growth industry right there. And the third thing is keep an eye on our website. We are looking to, over the course of the next year, to develop template letters to contact your politicians. We created one during the election in the UK, and we're looking to refresh that and create another one to make it as easy as possible for Bitcoiners in the UK to lobby their MPs. As we saw in the election in the US, this is a political issue now, and there's really no downside to you as a politician supporting Bitcoin. And there's a significant downside to you opposing it. Shout out to Sherrod Brown, Chief Architect of Choke Point 2, and Sayonara. He has lost his Senate position. So, so I'd say there's a couple of things. If you want to throw us some sats, they'd be gratefully received. However, if you want to join our organization, we're now transitioning to a membership organization, free for individuals. Have a look up. We're currently rebuilding the website. As soon as it's back up, have a look, get in touch. Any and all support is welcome.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, I encourage any UK listeners in my audience, check out Bitcoin Policy UK. I think I've got last I checked, I have maybe 7% of my listeners are in the UK. So guys, go and support Bitcoin Policy UK. I know, some of us Bitcoiners and libertarians have a kind of a view of not trying to engage with the state at all, but I really do think it's worthwhile trying to engage where possible, where there might be a chance of influencing things in a positive, pro liberty direction. So guys, go out and check it out. Links will be in the show notes. And Freddie, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Cheers, Stefan.